James Sullivan stood frozen at the edge of the bustling subway platform, his gaze locked on the young woman seated at the public piano. Her fingers danced over the keys with a grace that belied her surroundings. The melody was haunting, laced with a deep, inexplicable sorrow that seemed to rise from the depths of her soul. In the chaos of commuters rushing past, their footsteps and conversations became a distant hum. All James could hear was the music, a tune he had never heard before, but one that stirred something raw and familiar inside him. He hadn't planned on stopping. His life was a blur of scheduled rehearsals, performances, and meetings. As one of the most celebrated pianists in the country, his time was meticulously managed. But in that moment, time seemed to slow. Something in her music held him captive, and for reasons he couldn't quite grasp, he found himself drawn closer to her, almost involuntarily. The piano was old and worn, the keys yellowed with time, yet under her touch, it sang with a tragic beauty. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, slightly obscuring her face, but James could see the tension in her posture. She played with such intensity that it seemed as if the music was the only thing holding her together. Without thinking, James moved toward her, weaving through the crowd until he was standing just a few feet away. He watched as she closed her eyes, completely lost in the music, her expression tight with emotion. When the final note hung in the air, she let her hands fall gently onto her lap, exhaling as if the act of playing had drained the last of her energy. James, unsure of how to approach, cleared his throat softly. "That was incredible," he said, his voice hesitant, as if he feared breaking the spell she had cast over the space. The woman opened her eyes, startled. Her gaze flickered to him, then down at the piano, as if she was only now realizing she had an audience. "Thank you," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Do you mind if I ask?" James began, stepping closer. "Where did you learn to play like that? It's rare to hear someone play with such emotion." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "I didn't learn anywhere. I just play," she replied, her voice strained, almost as if the words cost her something to say. James studied her, noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness in her expression. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, but there was an undeniable weight to her, as if she carried a burden far too heavy for her years. "That piece, I've never heard it before," he continued, unable to let go of the feeling the music had left in him. "Did you compose it?" The woman looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the piano keys. "It's just something I play when I need to." James felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew all too well the catharsis that came from pouring one's emotions into music. But there was something more about her, something she wasn't saying. "I'm James," he said, extending his hand, hoping to ease the tension. She hesitated again before offering her hand in return, her grip light but cold. "Ava." "Ava," he repeated, letting the name settle. It felt familiar on his tongue, though he couldn't place why. "Ava, you play beautifully. I mean it. Have you ever thought about performing professionally?" Her hand withdrew quickly, her expression darkening. "No, I don't play for other people." James frowned, sensing a wall come up between them. "Why not? You have an extraordinary talent. You could." "I don't want to," she cut him off sharply, her voice suddenly defensive. Her eyes met his for the first time, and he saw something there that stopped him from pressing further. Pain. Deep, unhealed pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The subway roared to life again as a train pulled into the station, bringing with it a fresh wave of noise and commuters. James could have let it go, could have thanked her for the music and moved on with his life. But something inside him wouldn't allow it. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, unsure of how else to broach the subject. Ava looked down, her fingers absently tapping on the keys. "I don't know," she whispered, almost to herself. James took a breath, weighing his words carefully. "Listen, I don't know what you're going through, but if you ever need a place to stay, or just someone to talk to, I have space. My home is quiet. It might help." Ava's eyes flicked up to meet his again, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond at first, clearly taken aback by the offer. James felt a sudden rush of embarrassment, realizing how strange it must have sounded. A stranger offering his home to someone he had just met. But before he could backtrack, Ava spoke. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with suspicion. James hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but your music, it moved me. And I think, maybe, you need somewhere safe to rest for a while." For a long moment, Ava said nothing, her eyes searching his as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Okay," he repeated, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Let's go." As they walked side by side toward the subway exit, James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something far more profound than either of them could yet understand. They left the station together, two strangers bound by a shared sense of loneliness and a single, haunting melody that lingered in the air long after they were gone. The ride to James's home was steeped in silence. Ava sat beside him in the back of the car, her gaze fixed out the window as the cityscape blurred into a streak of lights. James stole glances at her, wondering if he had made the right choice. She hadn't spoken much since they left the subway, and her withdrawn posture told him that whatever brought her to play with such raw emotion, it wasn't something easily shared. The car pulled up to the quiet street where James's townhouse stood. Nestled in the upper part of Manhattan, the house was a stark contrast to the grimy subway station where they had met just hours ago. The stone facade, adorned with ivy, exuded a sense of old-world charm. As they approached, James felt a strange mixture of hesitation and anticipation. He had never invited anyone into this space, his sanctuary, where his life revolved around music and solitude. But Ava wasn't just anyone, and though they had only exchanged a handful of words, James already sensed the gravity of her presence. He unlocked the front door, pushing it open to reveal a grand foyer bathed in soft lighting. The scent of polished wood and old books greeted them, and the faintest echo of classical music played in the background from one of his earlier recordings. Ava stepped inside tentatively, her eyes scanning the room, as if unsure of where she fit in this world of quiet luxury. "You can make yourself at home," James said, his voice gentle. He gestured toward the living room where a grand piano stood in the center, its gleaming surface reflecting the dim lights above. Ava's gaze lingered on the instrument for a moment, but she made no move toward it. "I'll show you to your room," James added quickly, sensing her unease. He led her down a hallway lined with framed concert posters and photographs from his career, though she seemed to take little notice. They stopped in front of a guest room, the door creaking open to reveal a cozy space. A soft bed, a small desk by the window, and an adjoining bathroom. "This is it," James said, feeling awkward. "You can stay as long as you need." Ava nodded, stepping inside but remaining silent. James hovered in the doorway, unsure of what else to say. He wanted to ask her more, to understand what had led her to that subway station, but he sensed that she wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he opted for a softer approach. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything," he said. "Take your time." He left her in the room, the door clicking softly shut behind him. As he made his way back to the living room, James felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Curiosity, concern, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. There was something about Ava, something in the way she played, that had drawn him in from the moment he heard her. He sat down at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, but for the first time in years, he couldn't find the music. His mind was too preoccupied. Hours passed, and James lost track of time. The house was still, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of floorboards settling. He wondered if Ava had fallen asleep, but before he could go check, a soft melody filled the air. The sound came from upstairs, faint but unmistakable, the piano in her room. James's breath caught in his throat. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though not in the way he expected. It wasn't a famous piece from a composer he knew. It was personal, something intimate, and yet, it echoed the same sorrow she had played in the subway. Only now, there was more to it. It had depth, layers of sadness and yearning intertwined with a tenderness that James hadn't heard before. He stood up and moved quietly toward the stairs, drawn by the music as if under a spell. As he approached her room, the melody grew clearer, more vivid. The door was slightly ajar, and James hesitated for a moment before pushing it open just enough to peer inside. Ava sat at the small, upright piano in the corner of the room, her back to him. Her shoulders were hunched over, completely absorbed in the music, her fingers gliding over the keys with effortless precision. But it wasn't just her technical skill that mesmerized James. It was the emotion that poured from every note. He recognized it now. It was the same melody his mother had once played, a piece she had composed but never finished. No one else had ever heard it. It was a fragment of his childhood, a secret kept within the walls of his family's home, long forgotten, until now. James's chest tightened, his mind racing. How could she possibly know this music? He had never shared it with anyone. The notes were etched in his memory, a remnant of his mother's last days before her illness took her. It was something only he and his father had known, a piece of their family's history lost in time. He pushed the door open further, stepping inside without thinking. The floor creaked beneath his weight, and Ava's fingers froze on the keys. She turned slowly, her expression a mix of surprise and something darker, as if she had been caught revealing a secret she wasn't ready to share. "Where did you learn that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart pounding in his chest. Ava didn't answer right away. Her gaze dropped to her hands, still resting on the keys, and a heavy silence filled the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, trembling slightly. "My mother used to play it," she said. She never told me where it came from. It was just something she played when she was sad." James felt the room tilt around him, his mind struggling to process her words. He stepped closer, his voice shaking. "Your mother, how did she know that song?" Ava looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I don't know," she whispered. "I thought it was hers." James swallowed hard, a cold realization settling over him. His hands trembled as he gripped the back of a chair for support, his mind reeling with the implications. "Ava," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "that song, it wasn't just your mother's. It was my mother's too." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with meaning. Ava's eyes widened in shock, confusion etched across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The connection between them, so faint at first, now felt like a thread tying their pasts together in ways neither of them could have anticipated. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them both. And though neither of them could yet understand what it all meant, they both knew that this was only the beginning of a much deeper, far more complicated story. The weight of James's revelation hung in the air like an unspoken storm. Ava sat motionless at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys, though the music had long since faded. James stood a few feet away, his face pale, eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, as if a dam had just been broken, and neither was prepared for the flood of truth that was about to follow. Ava was the first to speak, though her voice came out in a fragile whisper. "Your mother? What do you mean? That can't be possible." James swallowed hard, feeling the floor beneath him tilt ever so slightly. "That song, my mother composed it. It's something she played often, something she wrote when she was going through." He stopped, his voice catching. The memories of his mother, frail and lost in her own music in the last years of her life, were not something he revisited often. He had locked them away, much like the melody Ava had just played. Ava stared at him, confusion and something darker, a spark of fear, swirling in her eyes. "I don't understand. My mother always played that song when she was upset. She said it was hers." Her gaze dropped again, her hands trembling slightly. "I grew up with it. I thought it was hers all along." James took a deep breath, struggling to put the pieces together. How could two women, seemingly unconnected, have shared such a deeply personal song? He stepped closer to her, trying to contain the rush of emotions clawing at him. Ava, he said carefully, do you know anything about your mother's past? Anything about her relationship history? Ava hesitated. Her face tightened with emotion, her expression guarded as though she was struggling with the urge to hide something. She rose from the piano bench, crossing her arms over her chest protectively. No, she muttered, avoiding his gaze. She didn't talk about it much. I always got the sense that there was something she didn't want me to know. James's heart pounded in his chest. There was something more here, something she was holding back. Ava, please, he said, his voice soft but insistent. You said she played this song when she was sad. Did she ever tell you why? Did she ever mention anything about a man she knew before you were born? Ava's lips parted as though she was about to speak, but she hesitated. Her eyes darted to the floor, and for a moment, James thought she might shut him out completely. But then, she seemed to make a decision, one that cost her something deeply personal. My mother, she began, her voice trembling. She always kept parts of her life hidden from me. Growing up, I never knew much about her past. She raised me on her own. There was no father in the picture. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I always thought it was because she chose to be alone, that maybe she didn't want me to know him. But there were letters. I found them after she passed. James felt a chill run down his spine. Letters? He asked, his voice barely audible. Ava nodded, her gaze still fixed on the floor. She kept them hidden. I found them in an old box under her bed, months after she was gone. I didn't know what to make of them at first. They were from a man. The letters were old, from years before I was born. They talked about a love that couldn't be, about mistakes made, and about me. Her voice wavered, and she looked up at James with eyes full of pain and confusion. The man in those letters, he never knew I existed. James's breath caught in his throat, the room spinning as her words sank in. Ava, he began, but he couldn't find the right words. His mind raced back to his youth, to a summer filled with passion and recklessness. A summer with a woman who had changed his life, but who he had lost too soon. Her name had been Lila. Ava continued, her voice stronger now as she gave life to the painful truth. I never understood why my mother kept all of this from me. But after reading those letters, I realized she was afraid. She didn't want to disrupt the man's life, didn't want to burden him. She left him, without ever telling him about me. And then she wrote him one last letter, but she never sent it. James took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room seemed to shrink around him as a memory, long buried, surged forward with brutal clarity. Lila, his Lila, the woman he had loved so fiercely and lost so completely. He had tried to move on, tried to forget her, but she had never truly left him. Could it be possible? Could Ava really be? Ava's voice pulled him back to the present. I didn't know what to do after I found those letters. It felt like my entire life had been a lie. The man my mother wrote about, he was a pianist. She described him in her letters, talked about his music, the way they met through a shared love of the piano. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. That's why I went to that subway station. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to find him, even if I didn't know who he was, even if it didn't make any sense. James stood frozen, his mind reeling. Every word Ava spoke fit too perfectly into the puzzle he had been unknowingly assembling since the moment he heard her play that song. He had never known about the child Lila carried, never known that she had left because she thought it was what he wanted. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The child he never knew existed was standing right in front of him. Ava, he said, his voice breaking, I think I know who your mother was. Ava looked at him sharply, her expression a mix of hope and fear. What do you mean? James took a shaky breath, stepping closer to her, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. Your mother, was she named Lila? Lila Daniels? Ava's eyes widened, her face going pale. How do you know her name? She whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. James's throat tightened, his hands trembling at his sides. I loved her, he said softly, a long time ago, before everything fell apart. She was everything to me, but she left, and I never knew why. I never knew about you. Ava stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and then to something deeper, recognition. The truth was there, between them, undeniable and raw. She was his daughter, the daughter he never knew he had. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a long moment, they stood in stunned silence, both struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Ava opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the piano to steady herself. "You're my father," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief and 1,000 unanswered questions. James couldn't find the words. All he could do was nod, the realization settling in with a heavy finality. Ava stood frozen by the piano, her body rigid as she tried to process the revelation. Her fingers hovered over the keys, as if seeking the same solace in music that she always had. But the weight of what had just been said pressed down on her like a tidal wave. James, the man who had taken her in, the one whose home she now stood in, was her father. A man she never knew, whose name her mother had never spoken aloud, now stood before her as both a stranger and a part of her life she couldn't yet comprehend. The silence between them was deafening, the air thick with a tension neither could easily break. James, standing only a few feet away, watched her with a mix of awe and guilt. His mind raced with memories of Lila, her laugh, her touch, the way she had looked at him all those years ago. He had spent so long wondering why she had left him, why she had disappeared without a word. And now he knew. She had been carrying Ava, his daughter. James's heart ached with the sudden weight of lost years. He took a tentative step forward, his voice barely audible. "Ava, I didn't know. If I had known, I would've." "Would've what?" Ava's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with anger and confusion. "You would have done what? Found me? Raised me? Do you really think that would have changed anything?" Her words were laced with bitterness, and James could see the pain etched into her expression, a lifetime of abandonment that she had carried without even realizing it. James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know. I don't know what I would have done, but I would have tried, Ava. I swear, I would have tried. If I had known." "But you didn't know," Ava snapped, cutting him off. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You didn't know because she didn't tell you. She kept you a secret from me, for my entire life. And now I'm supposed to just, what? Accept that you're my father? After all these years? After everything?" James flinched at her words, his chest tightening with the weight of her accusation. He had no answers, no explanations that would make sense of this moment. He could only feel the crushing guilt of time lost, of opportunities missed. "I'm not asking you to accept anything," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm just trying to understand, to make sense of this." Ava let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Make sense of it? How? There's nothing to make sense of. You weren't there, and now you are. But I don't even know you. I don't know who you are, or what you mean to me. You're just a man." Her words stung, but James couldn't blame her for how she felt. How could she possibly process this? He was a stranger to her, and yet the bond between them, one built on years of absence and unspoken truths, was undeniable. Ava turned away from him, her back to the piano once again. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, James saw not the angry, defensive woman who had confronted him, but the broken child she had once been, abandoned by a mother who had kept her in the dark about her past. "I don't even know where to start," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. This wasn't supposed to happen. James stepped closer, his heart aching for her. "Neither of us knew, Ava. I never knew about you. If I had, things might have been different." Ava shook her head. "But they weren't different. And now it's too late. My mother's gone. Everything she knew, everything she kept from me, it's all gone." James felt a pang of sorrow at the mention of Lila. The memories of their time together were vivid in his mind now, tinged with both the joy they had shared and the pain of their sudden separation. "I loved your mother," he said quietly. "I didn't understand why she left. I spent years trying to figure it out, but I never imagined it was because of you." Ava's shoulders stiffened, and she turned to face him again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice breaking. "All I wanted was— I don't even know what I wanted anymore." James wished he could say something to ease the pain, to bridge the gap between them, but there were no easy answers. All he had was the truth, a truth that had been hidden for so long. It now felt like a jagged edge cutting through both their lives. "I know this is overwhelming," James said softly. "It's overwhelming for me too. But maybe we can figure this out together. I don't know what that looks like, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." Ava didn't respond at first. She looked at him, her expression torn between anger and longing, as though part of her wanted to reject him, while another part wanted to accept the connection they shared. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and sat down at the piano, her hands resting on the keys without playing. "I don't even know where to begin," she murmured. James moved to stand beside her, his presence cautious yet steady. "We don't have to figure it out all at once. We can start with the music, if that's easier." Ava glanced at him, a small flicker of something softer in her eyes. "The music, that's all I've ever had," she admitted. "It's the only thing that's made sense to me. But now, even that feels tainted." James shook his head. "No, it's not tainted. It's what brought us together. It's the one thing we share." Ava hesitated, her fingers brushing over the keys. "My mother always said that music was the language of things we couldn't say out loud. She played this song when she missed someone. I always thought it was just something she felt, something she needed to express. I didn't realize it was about you." James felt his heart twist at her words. "She never told me about you, Ava. But now, hearing you play that song, it's like I'm hearing it for the first time all over again. And it's not just my mother's music anymore. It's yours too." Ava's fingers pressed down gently on the keys, coaxing a soft, tentative melody from the piano. It was the same song, but this time, it sounded different. There was something new in the way she played it, a fragility that hadn't been there before. It was as if the music itself was trying to make sense of the emotions neither of them could put into words. James closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. In that moment, the pain of lost years, the confusion, the unanswered questions, all of it faded into the background. There was only the music and the shared understanding that despite everything, they were connected. When the last note faded, Ava sat in silence for a long time, her hands resting on the keys. She didn't look at James, but her voice was softer when she finally spoke. "I don't know what this means. I don't know how to be your daughter." James felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced himself to speak through it. "We'll figure it out. Together." Ava glanced at him, her eyes still clouded with uncertainty, but there was a faint glimmer of something else, hope. She nodded, just once, and for the first time since the truth had come crashing down between them, James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The past had left scars, but the future was still unwritten. The following days passed in a strange blur of uncertainty and silence. Ava kept mostly to herself, spending hours alone in the room James had given her, and when she wasn't there, she sat at the piano, playing melodies that seemed to mirror her emotions, haunting, fragmented, and filled with a sadness she couldn't fully express. James found himself listening to her from a distance, wondering if the music was her way of processing everything that had been revealed, or if it was simply the only way she knew how to cope. James, too, was struggling. The revelation of Ava's existence had shaken him to his core. It was as if a part of his past had been resurrected, but it came with the heavy burden of knowing how much time they had lost. Lila's absence, once a painful memory, now felt like a wound that had been reopened. And every time he looked at Ava, he saw Lila's face. The same dark eyes, the same way she carried herself with a quiet intensity that hid deeper emotions. One evening, after Ava had gone to bed, James sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled into the night. He stared at the empty fireplace, his mind wandering back to the days when he and Lila had been together. It had been years, but the memories were still vivid. He could see her clearly in his mind. The way she used to laugh at his awkward attempts to impress her, the way her fingers used to trace patterns on his arm when they lay in bed together, talking about their dreams for the future. He had loved her with a fierceness that scared him, and he had been devastated when she left without a word, vanishing from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. James had spent months searching for her, reaching out to mutual friends, asking questions, but no one seemed to know where she had gone. It was as if she had disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving behind only the ghost of her memory and the faint echo of her music. He had never gotten over her, not really. He had buried himself in his career, throwing all his energy into his music, but Lila had always been there, lingering in the corners of his mind like a song he couldn't stop replaying. Now, sitting in the dimly lit room, James felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. He wondered how different his life would have been if he had known about Ava. Would he have been a good father? Would he have been able to give her the life she deserved? Or would he have failed her the same way he had failed Lila? The thoughts swirled in his mind, heavy and unrelenting. He reached for the old box he had brought down from the attic earlier in the day, the one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants of his time with Lila, photographs, letters, small mementos of the life they had shared. James hadn't had the strength to look at them before, but now, with Ava upstairs, he felt the need to revisit the past. He opened the box carefully, as if afraid the memories inside might break apart if he wasn't gentle. The first thing he pulled out was a photograph, a black and white picture of him and Lila sitting by the river, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes closed in contentment. James stared at the photo for a long time, his heart aching with the weight of what they had lost. Beneath the photograph was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. He hesitated before untying them, the familiar ache of longing and regret washing over him. These were the letters they had exchanged during the brief period they were apart, when Lila had gone to visit her family and James had stayed behind for a series of performances. He hadn't read them in years, but as he unfolded the first letter, her voice came back to him, clear and full of the same warmth he remembered. "James," the letter began, "I miss you more than I thought possible. It's strange, being away from you. I keep thinking about all the things we'll do when I get back. There's a new song I've been working on. I can't wait to play it for you. I think it's the best thing I've written so far. It's about us." James's throat tightened as he read the words, his mind drifting back to the night Lila had returned from that trip. She had played this song for him, a beautiful, bittersweet melody that had filled the room with a sense of longing and hope. He had fallen in love with her all over again that night, and they had talked for hours about their future, making plans they never got to see through. The second letter was more somber, written just days before she left him. "James, I don't know how to say this, but things feel different now. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I feel like I'm slipping away. I can't explain it. I just need some space to figure things out. Please understand. I love you, but I don't know if I'm enough." James closed his eyes, the familiar sting of regret tightening his chest. He hadn't understood what she meant at the time, hadn't realized how deeply she was struggling. He had been too focused on his music, too wrapped up in his own world to see the pain she was hiding. And by the time he had noticed, it had been too late. There was one last letter in the box, one that he had never opened. It had arrived weeks after Lila had left, and by then, James had been too heartbroken to read it. He had tucked it away in the box, telling himself he would look at it one day when he was ready. But that day had never come, until now. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. The handwriting was familiar, but shaky, as if Lila had written it in a hurry. "James," it began, "there's something I never told you. I didn't know how to tell you at the time, and now I realize that keeping this from you was the biggest mistake of my life. I'm pregnant. I don't know what to do. I've tried to think of a way to explain it, but I can't. I'm leaving because I don't want to complicate your life. You have your career, and I can't ask you to give that up for me and the baby. I'm sorry. I'll love you always." James's heart stopped as the words sank in. His vision blurred. and he had to set the letter down to steady himself. He had never known. She had left because she thought it was best for him, because she hadn't wanted to burden him with the news. All these years, and he had never known. Suddenly, everything made sense. The music, Ava's presence, the way she looked at him with those same dark eyes Lila had. He had missed so much, lost so much time with a daughter he never knew he had. James wiped at his eyes, blinking away the tears that had gathered there. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had been made, but he could try to make up for it now. He could try to be the father Ava needed, even if it was years too late. He stood up, the letter still clutched in his hand, and made his way to the stairs. He needed to talk to Ava. He needed to tell her the truth, to let her know that he hadn't abandoned her, that he hadn't known. And more than that, he needed her to know that he wanted to be a part of her life, if she would let him. When he reached her door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could hear the soft sound of the piano playing from within, the same haunting melody that had brought them together in the first place. He took a deep breath and knocked softly, waiting for her to answer. After a moment, the music stopped, and Ava's voice came through the door, quiet and unsure. "Come in." James pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. Ava was sitting at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She looked up at him, her expression guarded, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I need to show you something," James said, his voice trembling slightly. He stepped forward, holding out the letter. "It's from your mother." Ava's eyes widened, and she took the letter from him carefully, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. As she read the words, her expression changed, a mixture of shock and sadness crossing her face. "She never told me," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. "She never told me why she left." James sat down beside her, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "She thought she was protecting us both. But I swear, Ava, if I had known, I would have been there for you. I would have been there for both of you." Ava didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, staring at the letter in her hands, as if trying to reconcile the truth of her past with the present. Finally, she looked up at James, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice trembling. James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Ava's question hung in the air between them, thick with uncertainty. James could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, a question he had no easy answer for. Where do we go from here? The truth was, he didn't know. He wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them, how to erase the years of absence and missed opportunities. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk away now. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice soft but steady. "We take it one step at a time. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, Ava. I don't expect this to be easy, but I'm here, and I want to figure this out with you. Together." Ava's fingers tightened slightly around his, her eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. Anger, fear, and something else, something more vulnerable. She pulled her hand back slowly, as if unsure whether to let him in or keep him at arm's length. "I don't know if I can just start over," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was alone. My mother never. She never told me about you. And now, you're here, but it feels like everything is upside down." James nodded, understanding her confusion all too well. His life had been turned upside down the moment he heard her play that first note. He wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew it wasn't his place. "Not yet. I know this is hard," James said gently. "I can't imagine how confusing this must be for you, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. If you need space, I'll give you space. If you want to talk, I'll listen. Whatever you need, Ava, I'll be here." Ava didn't respond immediately. She stood up from the piano bench, pacing the room as if the movement might help her untangle the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. I've spent my whole life wondering why my mother kept everything from me. She had so many secrets, and I never understood why. Now I'm starting to see the pieces come together, but it just makes me feel like I didn't know her at all." James felt a pang of sympathy. He understood the frustration of unanswered questions, of feeling like the person you thought you knew was suddenly a stranger. "Your mother was complicated," James said quietly. "She had her reasons for keeping this from you, from both of us. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you." "I know she did." Ava stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping as she stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street below. "I know she loved me," she whispered, "but it still hurts. It hurts that she didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." James's heart ached for her. He could hear the pain in her voice, the sense of betrayal that came from a lifetime of secrets. He wished he could take that pain away, but he knew this was something Ava had to process on her own. All he could do was be there for her. "I don't think it was about trust," James said softly. "I think she was trying to protect you. From what? I don't know. But whatever her reasons, they don't change the fact that you're here now, and we have a chance to get to know each other. If you want that." Ava turned to face him, her expression conflicted. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "Part of me wants to know you, to understand where I come from. But another part of me is so angry. I'm angry that I had to find out this way, angry that my life feels like it's been ripped apart." James nodded, feeling a deep sense of empathy. "You have every right to be angry," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me or your mother right away. I just want a chance to try." Ava's gaze softened, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But maybe we can start with something small." James felt a flicker of hope at her words. "What do you have in mind?" he asked carefully, not wanting to push her too far, too fast. Ava hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You said we could start with music. I guess that's something we share, isn't it?" James's heart swelled with emotion. Music had always been the one thing that made sense to him, the one constant in his life. If it could help him connect with Ava, even in the smallest way, he would hold on to it with everything he had. "Yes," he said softly, "it's something we share." Ava looked down at the piano, her fingers brushing over the keys. "I don't think I'm ready to talk about everything else yet," she admitted. "But maybe we can play together. Just play." James nodded, understanding her need for simplicity. "We can do that," he agreed. "We don't have to talk. We'll just play." Ava sat down at the piano, and James took a seat beside her. For a moment, they both hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Then, slowly, Ava placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was soft, tentative, as if she was testing the waters. James listened, letting her take the lead, and after a few moments, he joined her. Their music flowed together, two voices intertwined in harmony. The notes filled the room, creating a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect. There were moments where the rhythm faltered, where they hesitated, unsure of where the other was going. But it didn't matter. They were playing together, and that was enough. As the final notes of the song faded into the silence, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. He glanced at Ava, who was staring down at the piano, her expression thoughtful. She didn't say anything, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. A small, almost imperceptible softening of the walls she had built around herself. "That was nice," Ava said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. James smiled, his heart lifting. It was. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the air between them filled with something new. It wasn't quite understanding, and it wasn't yet trust, but it was a beginning. And for the first time since Ava had walked into his life, James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Ava stood up slowly, her movements hesitant. "I think I'm going to go for a walk," she said, her voice still soft but steadier now. "I need some time to think." James nodded, respecting her need for space. "Take all the time you need." As Ava left the room, James remained at the piano, his fingers lightly tracing the keys. The sound of the door clicking shut behind her echoed in the quiet room, and he let out a long, slow breath. He knew they still had a long way to go, but tonight, for the first time, they had played together. It was a small step, but it was a step towards something that could heal both of them. James leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the past slowly start to lift. There would be more conversations, more difficult moments to navigate, but tonight, they had found common ground in the music. And in that moment, it was enough. The next morning, the house felt different. A quiet anticipation hung in the air, a sense that something had shifted between them. James woke early, half expecting to find Ava already gone. But instead, he found her in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but not as distant as before. "Morning," James said, trying to sound casual despite the tension in his chest. "Morning," Ava replied, her voice soft but steady. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes flicking toward the window, where the early light streamed in. James stood awkwardly by the counter, unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask her how she was feeling, if she had thought about their conversation the night before, but he didn't want to push her. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, waiting for her to speak first. After a long silence, Ava set her cup down, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice tentative, "about what you said last night. About trying to figure this out together." James nodded, not wanting to interrupt her. "I don't know how to do this," Ava admitted, her gaze focused on the table. "I don't know how to just start being your daughter." "You don't have to know," James said gently. "We'll figure it out. There's no right way to do this. We'll go at whatever pace you need." Ava sighed, her fingers curling into her palm. "I'm still angry," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "I'm angry at my mom for keeping this from me. I'm angry that I spent my whole life not knowing you were out there. And I'm angry that now, I have to deal with all of this when I didn't ask for any of it." James felt a pang of guilt. He had been thinking the same thing, that Ava hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked for her life to be turned upside down by the truth of their connection. But he also knew that the only way forward was through the anger. "You have every right to be angry," James said softly. "I understand that. I'm angry too, at myself for not knowing, for not being there when I should have been." Ava's gaze flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging between them. Then, she broke the silence. "It's not just the anger," she confessed. "It's the fear. I'm scared that if I let you in, if I start to let myself care, it'll all fall apart again. I don't know if I can handle losing another person I care about." James's chest tightened at her words. He hadn't realized how deeply that fear ran in her, but it made sense. Losing her mother, discovering the truth about her father. It had all left her vulnerable, and now, the thought of opening herself up again was terrifying. He wanted to reassure her, to promise that he would never leave. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. "I can't promise that things will always be easy," James said carefully, "but I can promise that I'm not going anywhere. I want to be in your life, Ava. I've missed so much already, and I don't want to miss any more." Ava stared down at the table, her expression unreadable. For a moment, James feared he had pushed too hard, said too much. But then, she nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Relief washed over him, but he kept his emotions in check, knowing that this was just the beginning. Ava wasn't ready to fully trust him yet, but she was giving him a chance, and that was more than he had dared hope for. "I don't know what this looks like yet," Ava continued, her voice still hesitant, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes." James smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. That's all I could ask for. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The awkwardness that had been there before was still present, but it was softer now, less suffocating. There was a tentative understanding between them, a fragile thread of connection that neither of them wanted to break. "I've been thinking about my mom," Ava said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "about how much I still don't know about her. I think I want to know more. About her past. About your time together." James's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time Ava had mentioned wanting to know more about Lila, and he wasn't sure how much he should say. But if Ava was asking, then maybe it was time to share what he could. "I'll tell you everything I remember," James promised. Everything you want to know. Ava nodded, her expression still uncertain but tinged with a flicker of hope. Okay, she said quietly. Let's start there. The days that followed were a delicate dance of tentative conversations and long silences. Ava had opened the door to her mother's past, and though it was painful, James understood her need for answers. He, too, wanted to fill in the gaps, to help her piece together the woman who had meant so much to both of them. One evening, after dinner, they found themselves sitting in the living room, the air between them heavy with unspoken questions. Ava looked at James, her expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Tell me about her," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "Tell me about my mom. What was she like before I was born?" James felt a familiar tightness in his chest as memories of Lila came flooding back. He had spent years burying those memories, trying to move on from the heartbreak she had left behind. But now, with Ava sitting in front of him, it was impossible to keep those memories at bay. He owed her the truth, about Lila, about their love, and about the choices that had led to their separation. Lila was complicated, James began, his voice thick with emotion. She was passionate, intense. She had this way of seeing the world that was so different from anyone I'd ever known. She was full of life, full of dreams, but she also carried a lot of pain. I didn't realize how deep that pain ran until it was too late. Ava nodded, listening intently as James continued. "We met at a recital," James said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he remembered. "She was playing the piano, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She had this energy, this fire in her music that just pulled me in. After the recital, I introduced myself, and from that moment on, we were inseparable." James hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the piano in the corner of the room. "We fell in love fast. It was intense, overwhelming at times. But there was always this darkness in her. She didn't talk much about her past, about her family. She kept parts of herself hidden, even from me." Ava shifted in her seat, her brow furrowed. "Did she ever mention why she left you?" James exhaled, his heart heavy. "Not really. We had our arguments, like any couple, but nothing that seemed serious enough to tear us apart. And then one day, she was just gone. No explanation, no goodbye. I searched for her, tried to understand why she left, but I never got an answer. Until now." Ava's eyes filled with emotion as she listened, her fingers gripping the edge of the armchair. "She never told me about you. Not once. I grew up thinking it was just the two of us. But I always felt like there was something she wasn't telling me." James nodded, understanding the depth of Ava's frustration. "She loved you, Ava. I know that much. Whatever her reasons for keeping me a secret, I believe she did it because she thought it was best for you. But I wish she had given me a chance to be there. For both of you." Ava looked down, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I wish she had too." The room fell into a heavy silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. James felt the weight of everything he had lost. The years without Lila, without Ava. But now, sitting here with his daughter, there was a glimmer of hope that maybe they could find a way to move forward. "I know this is hard," James said gently, breaking the silence. "But we don't have to figure it all out at once. We can take our time. I'm not going anywhere." Ava looked up at him, her expression softening. "It's just hard to believe. All my life, I thought I knew who I was. But now, everything feels different." "I understand," James said quietly. "But no matter what happens, you're still you. And you're still my daughter. That hasn't changed." Ava's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time since they had met, she let her guard down completely. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be your daughter." James's heart ached at her words, but he reached out, placing his hand gently over hers. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." Ava nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." For the first time, there was a sense of peace between them. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but in that moment, they had found something real, something that connected them beyond the years of distance and pain. As they sat in the quiet of the living room, The past no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier. It was still there, lingering in the shadows. But now there was room for something new, something hopeful. James glanced at Ava, a small smile playing on his lips. "Would you like to play something?" Ava hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "I think I would." They walked together to the piano, side by side, the weight of their shared history no longer as heavy as before. There was still so much left unsaid, so many emotions yet to be explored, but for now, the music would speak for them. The days slipped into a comfortable routine, yet a fragile one, like the soft echo of a melody that could be interrupted at any moment. James and Ava played together more often, their music becoming a language of its own, one that spoke of unspoken pain and tentative healing. The notes they shared carried more than just harmony. They carried the weight of a past neither had fully confronted. But as the days passed, it became clear that music alone wouldn't be enough. They needed answers, real answers, and the unresolved history between them lingered like a shadow in the corners of every room. One night, as the sky outside darkened and a light rain began tapping against the windows, Ava sat at the piano, her fingers trailing over the keys in thought rather than action. James watched her from the armchair across the room, sensing that something was building inside her, something that had been waiting to break free. "I've been thinking a lot about her," Ava said quietly, her voice breaking the silence like a single note in a quiet room. "About Mom." James set down the book he hadn't been reading and leaned forward, listening intently. He knew this conversation had been coming. It was inevitable. Ava's hands dropped into her lap, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I still don't understand why she didn't tell me about you. About us." She wasn't the kind of person to keep secrets, or at least, I didn't think she was. Her voice was tinged with frustration, the pain of not knowing surfacing again. James felt a pang of guilt. He had asked himself that same question for years. "I don't think she meant to hurt you, Ava," he said gently. "She was trying to protect you, in her own way." Ava shook her head, her eyes flashing with a mix of sadness and anger. "Protect me from what? You? From the truth?" She paused, swallowing hard as the words continued to pour out. "I keep thinking about what life would have been like if she told me. If you'd known about me sooner, would things have been different?" James exhaled slowly, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he admitted, the raw honesty in his voice cutting through the tension. "I've asked myself the same thing. I've spent so many years wondering what could have been if I'd known about you, if your mom had stayed. But I think she was scared. Scared that I wouldn't choose you. Scared that she would ruin the life I had built." Ava looked at him sharply, her brows furrowing. "But you would have chosen us, right?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. James's throat tightened, but he didn't shy away from the truth. "I would have, yes. But your mother, she didn't believe that. She saw my career taking off, and I think she worried that I wouldn't be able to balance both. She thought she was doing the right thing by leaving, even if it was the hardest choice she ever made." Ava stared at him, the conflict clear in her eyes. "So she just decided for you? For both of us?" "She thought she was protecting us," James said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "But in the end, we all lost something because of it." The room fell into silence again, the rain outside growing heavier. James could see the storm of emotions playing across Ava's face, the frustration of not having the answers she needed, the confusion over her mother's choices, and the pain of what had been taken from them both. Ava turned back to the piano, her fingers resting on the keys as though they might provide her with the comfort she desperately sought. But she didn't play. Instead, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm stuck between two lives, the one I had with her and the one I might have had with you." James's chest tightened at her words, the depth of her pain hitting him harder than he expected. He stood up and crossed the room, sitting down beside her on the piano bench. He didn't reach for her hand this time. He knew better than to force a connection she wasn't ready for. But his presence beside her was steady, his voice gentle. "You don't have to choose between those lives, Ava. You can have both. The memories you have of your mother, the life you built with her, those are yours. And they always will be. But now, We have a chance to build something new, together. It doesn't have to erase what you had. It can be something separate, something that grows alongside it. Ava looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. It's just hard. I'm still so angry at her for leaving, for keeping you a secret, but I also miss her. And I hate that I'll never be able to ask her why. I'll never know what she was thinking. James nodded, understanding the pain of unanswered questions all too well. I wish I could give you those answers, Ava. I wish I could make it easier. But maybe we can find peace with the past by moving forward. Together. Ava blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, her voice trembling as she spoke. Do you really think we can do that? James smiled softly, his heart aching but hopeful. I do. I think we're already doing it. Ava looked down at the piano, her fingers finally pressing the keys with a gentle touch. A soft melody filled the room, one that spoke of sorrow and hope intertwined. James listened, feeling the music wrap around them like a fragile thread, holding them together despite the weight of everything they had been through. They played together, the music speaking the words neither of them could say aloud. And for the first time since Ava had entered his life, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would still be difficult, but they were moving forward. And that was enough. Weeks passed, and the sharp edges of the past began to soften. The house that had once felt filled with silence now echoed with the sound of music. James and Ava played together often, but more than that, they talked. Slowly, carefully, they began to bridge the gap that years of secrets and distance had created. It wasn't easy, but they were learning how to let each other in. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the windows, they sat together in the living room. There was no piano between them this time, just the quiet of the room and the soft hum of life outside. Ava sat cross-legged on the floor, sifting through old photos of her mother that James had brought down from the attic. Her expression was calmer now, the anger that had once been so sharp dulling into something more like acceptance. She was beautiful, Ava said quietly, holding up a photo of Lila, her face softened by a smile as she sat at the piano, her fingers poised over the keys. I never realized how much I look like her. James glanced at the photo, his chest tightening with both love and loss. You do, he said, his voice gentle. You have her eyes. But you're your own person, Ava. You're not just a reflection of her. Ava nodded, her eyes still on the photo. I'm starting to understand that, she said softly. For so long, I felt like I was chasing her shadow, trying to live up to some version of her that I'd created in my mind. But now I see that I don't have to do that. I can just be me. James smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Ava had come so far from the angry, lost woman who had played that haunting melody in the subway. She was still finding her way, but now there was hope in her eyes. Hope for something more than just the pain of her past. I'm glad you're here, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I know this hasn't been easy, but I'm so grateful we've had this time together. I've missed so much, and I don't want to miss anything else. Ava looked up at him, her expression soft but serious. I'm glad I'm here too, she admitted. At first, I didn't think I could handle it. I didn't know how to process everything. But being here, with you, it's helping. I don't feel as lost anymore. James felt a surge of relief at her words. You're not alone, Ava. You never were. And you never will be. Ava set the photo down, drawing in a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about what's next, she said, her voice steady. I feel like I'm finally ready to start living my own life. Not just one that's tied to the past. James nodded, understanding her need for independence. What do you want to do? He asked, his voice careful, not wanting to influence her decision. I don't know for sure yet, Ava said, a small smile playing on her lips, but I do know I want to keep playing. Music has always been the one thing that makes sense to me, even when everything else feels out of control. I want to see where it can take me. James's heart swelled with pride. You're incredibly talented, Ava. You could go as far as you want with your music. Ava smiled, but there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I know I'm good, but it's more than just playing. I want to use it to connect with people. The way I've been able to connect with you. I want to do that through my music, for others. James reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You have that gift, Ava. You play with your heart. People will feel that. She met his eyes, and for the first time since they had met, she looked truly at peace. I think I'm finally ready to let people in, she said quietly, including you. James's heart ached with love for his daughter. He had spent so many years wondering what could have been, and now, as they sat together in the quiet of the evening, he realized that this connection, this shared understanding, was more than he could have ever hoped for. I'm proud of you, James said, his voice thick with emotion. No matter what you do, I'm proud of the person you've become. Ava's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she smiled. Thanks, Dad, she said softly, the word Dad slipping out naturally for the first time. James's heart skipped a beat at the sound of it. He had waited his entire life to hear that word from her, and now it was real. They had come so far, and while the road ahead would still have its challenges, they were facing it together. Do you want to play something? James asked, sensing the emotion between them and wanting to channel it into the one thing that had always brought them closer. Ava nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. Yeah, let's play. They moved to the piano, sitting side by side as they had so many times before. This time, though, there was no hesitation. Ava's hands moved confidently over the keys, and James followed her lead. The melody they created was soft, filled with a quiet hope and a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. As the final notes hung in the air, Ava looked at James and smiled. This feels right, she said softly. James smiled back, his heart full. It does. In that moment, James knew that the past no longer had the power to hold them back. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found a way forward, together. The music was their guide, but their bond as father and daughter was what would carry them into the future. And that was the beginning of something beautiful. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.